Alright, so let's take some time to go through the Second Amendment to the Constitution of Zimbabwe, which is currently at the public consultation phase. The first thing I want to say before getting into the details of the amendment bill is the fact that we must accept that there is no perfect constitution. And I know a lot of people believe genuinely that the government must not be amending the constitution, they must be implementing the constitution, and there's a lot of value to that argument. But we must also realize the fact that every constitution, like every other document, is subject to change. The enactment of the constitution doesn't end the constitutional conversation, and in fact we can come together and ask ourselves, that is the constitution working for us, and to what extent are the provisions effective? So we must accept the fact that the constitution has got its own imperfections. So the constitution, not necessarily perfect, the amendment not perfect either, which is why we must discuss both and the extent to which the amendment will at least amount to an improvement on the constitution, and if not, we must be in a position to organize in order to reject the amendment. So an amendment by itself is not a bad thing, right? That's the reason why, for instance, in the United States, the references to their constitutional rights are in terms of amendments. The First Amendment, right to free speech; Second Amendment, right to bear arms, because the initial constitution did not contain human rights, so to speak, and those had to be introduced through a Bill of Rights, which is why we generally then refer to it as a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights had to be introduced in order to amend. And our entire constitution is an amendment, isn't it? The 20th Amendment to the Lancaster House Constitution. So an amendment by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. So let's look into the Second Amendment bill, and I'm going to do so in 4 categories so that there's clarity. I'll address the good, the bad, what I'll call a mix, which contains good and bad, and the final category, which I just call blah. That is the blah section, which really refers to the fact that I have not been able to find anything that is necessarily good or bad in certain parts of the amendment. So you can take those as you will. So starting with the good, what is good in the Second Amendment bill? Well, I would start with the fact that it extends the proportional representation seats for women. So we're keeping our quantitative representative character towards a historically oppressed group. It introduces a youth quota, so there will be seats also for young people in parliament. That is good. It reintroduces the office of the public protector, who will be working more or less in collaboration with the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, but focusing on the administrative conduct of government ministries and other offices which an act of parliament can provide for. But the important thing about the public protector will be the fact that they will be covering cases where there is no remedy which can be secured out of the courts or out of an appeal from the court. So that is very important, particularly for people whose claims have prescribed, quote unquote, which is the term that is used when a case can no longer be taken to court, even if it may be good on the merits, but it is now out of time, legally speaking. So that is good. And another good provision in the amendment is the changing of the composition of provincial and metropolitan councils. In the current constitution, the metropolitan and provincial councils include all members who are elected from that particular province or metropolitan area. So what that would mean is that in the provincial council, you have all the members of the National Assembly, all members of the Senate, and even the president of the Chiefs Council and deputy sit in the councils where they are from. So all those have been removed. The government is saying we don't want this duplication of roles. So that has significantly reduced the size of the provincial councils. That is very important, not only in terms of cost, but also it shows that the government seems to have an imagination of devolution of power, which it actually wants to enact constitutionally, and then progressively the hope is we can get the act out of parliament so that these councils are established. So it represents progress of sorts. So I would say that is good. That's it. I think that is the extent to which I will say there are good provisions in this amendment bill. So let's move to the bad. And these are the purely bad provisions, the ones where I have not found a mix. The first of which is the removal of parliamentary oversight for deals that are agreed between the Zimbabwean government and foreign entities. So the definition of international organization is being changed so that it doesn't include foreign entities, which means it is only those agreements between the state of Zimbabwe and other states or other institutions which represent 2 or more states, which is basically intergovernmental organizations. Those are the ones which will be subject to parliamentary oversight, meaning there can be agreements which have got an effect on the public purse that the government agrees without having to present to parliament, as long as it's a foreign entity which doesn't represent states. And that is obviously inimical to democracy, because as taxpayers we must be able to exercise oversight through our elected representatives. That is bad. And the extent to which this amendment increases the size of government is obviously bad on the public purse, and that is just the reality. If you're going to introduce a youth quota, extend the women's quota, the government is either remaining or even growing bigger, and there is a degree to which this amendment reduces transparency and accountability in ways I will now deal with. So the bulk and the controversial parts of this bill I'm dealing with in what I've called the mix, because I know a lot of people have said it's straight cut between increasing the powers of the president and removing interviews. But when you look at the actual bill, it gets a bit more complicated. So let's start with the fact that the government is proposing to remove public interviews in the appointment of the prosecutor general. And a lot of people have rightly pointed out that, well, this reduces accountability and transparency and is just giving powers to the president to appoint this very powerful officer. However, what we should note is the fact that the amendment states that the public interviews will be removed and the appointment of the prosecutor general will be by the president, but acting on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission. And it's very important here for us to pay attention to what it means when the president is required to make an appointment on the advice of an institution, because in section 339 of the Constitution it states that if the president appoints on the advice of a particular body, then he is obliged to follow the advice from that body. And that is distinguished from when the president makes an appointment after consultation with a body, and in that circumstance the president only has to listen and give careful consideration. That's what the Constitution says, but the president is not actually obliged to follow whatever that body says. So when it comes to the prosecutor general, the removal of public interviews, which, let's recall, public interviews were held by the Judicial Service Commission. It's this same body. And that body is now empowered to give advice to the president, which the president has to follow. So even though people are saying this is increasing the powers of the president, I read it as an increase of the powers of the Judicial Service Commission, because the president has to act on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission. So, I mean, people who are fixating on the public interview process, I think, are susceptible to overstating the efficacy, overstating the effectiveness of the public interview process. Let's look at that particular position of Prosecutor General, because after the enactment of the 2013 Constitution with Johannes Tomana, he left. Then we had Advocate Reb Goba very briefly. Now we have Kumbira Hodzi, and we've got a case which is still pending in the Constitutional Court, which is challenging the appointment of Kumbira Hodzi based on the fact that, well, look, in terms of the public interview process, he did not, that's the allegation, he did not score particularly highly. I think they say he came 5th or last, and they say, but how come he was then appointed? Because the president rejected the initial list that was given to him by the JSC, as he's empowered to do, and then later he made this appointment. And the JSC has made it clear in its court papers that the public interview process is not the singularly determinative aspect of appointing an officer. There are other factors. It's purely performative. In other words, that yes, there's a public aspect to people coming and watching, but scoring highly in that interview does not actually mean you're going to be appointed. So the JSC itself retains a lot of powers in determining who is appointed as prosecutor general, regardless of what happens in the public interview process. So it may be important in terms of making it look like the public is involved, but I don't see the extent to which the public is involved, particularly when you don't actually have appointments made subject to the results of those public interviews. And the Constitution does not state that the results of the public interview process must significantly influence the nominees sent by the JSC to the president. So for me, it's something of a ruse, and I respect the fact that the government is saying, okay, look, we were really not paying attention to these public interviews, so why are we holding them? They are long, arduous, expensive. So if the public interviews are not working in terms of having influence on the process, why have them rather than just have that body, the JSC, which already has those powers, because the public interview process is not so determinative? make the recommendations to the president. So for me, it's not so clear cut in terms of increasing the powers of the president, because I don't really see the extent to which the current system is materially different, except for the fact that it's more wasteful. I know people want the constitution to be implemented. It was implemented in respect of Kumprayo. People are still complaining, and that is because the effect of the public interviews has been overstated, in my view. The other controversial aspect of the bill is the fact that the president will be empowered to promote sitting judges of the High Court and Supreme Court without a public interview process. Again, this has been characterized as an increase of the powers of the president, and I state yet again that this amendment states, first of all, this new provision is optional, so it is different from that in respect of the prosecutor general. So public interviews are actually still relevant for judges. For appointment of judges, even for quote-unquote the promotion of judges, public interviews are still relevant. What the amendment does is introduce an option, and it says the president may appoint a judge from the High Court or Supreme Court to fill a vacancy in a superior court, acting on the recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission. So we are back again. This is the Judicial Service Commission making a recommendation to the president, and the president acting on it. So yet again, this to me is an increase of power of the Judicial Service Commission. Some may wonder, what is the Judicial Service Commission? Well, it's a body that comprises our top judges, predominantly Chief Justice, Deputy Judge, President, and then the judges collectively also elect another member. It also includes the Attorney General, Chief Magistrate, a representative of academics, from accounting, from human resources, and that body is the one charged with conducting a lot of these interviews and submitting nominees. So they are the ones who make the call. They are the ones who make the decision. If they think that they don't have to go through a public interview process to fill a vacancy of that nature. So it's the JSC. And the thinking is, like most of us have been in jobs where you do have a public interview in order to be accepted as an employee, and then you can be promoted internally without the need for further interviews. So the thinking behind it is the fact that if you get a job, and let's say it's a senior position, which is why they are limiting it to like High Court and Supreme Court, you get a senior position in a job, and then when you want to get a promotion, should it not lie with your employer to say, okay, I have seen his performance and his or her performance, and we can promote them? Or must it go back to further interviews when you want to be promoted to another position and another position? So that is the thinking, that do we need to proliferate the interviews when someone has been found worthy to be appointed as a judge? You may disagree with that, but yet again, this is about the JSC itself looking into somebody they employ, because the JSC is the employer, and saying, is this person worth it? And let's remember, the public interview process is really driven by the JSC, and they're the ones who submit the nomination. So again, this is borderline yet again, because all judges will need a public interview process to become a judge, and then the AJSC is an option. So the interviews are not being taken away. It is an option to recommend to the president to make an appointment. I'm not really sure whether I'm able to say that is bad or not there, because the JSC is still playing the same pivotal role. It is not as though the president has been empowered to just make an appointment after consultation. It's on the recommendation of that particular body, which is the employer of judges in any event. The next controversial part of the bill is the extension of tenure of some judges. So judges of the highest courts, the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court, who are supposed to retire at 70. So the bill says they can then opt to have annual renewals up to a period of 5 years beyond 70, subject to provision of medical certification of physical and mental fitness, which has to be accepted by the president after consultation with the JSC. So that's before we start a critique here, let's note the fact that when it comes to judicial tenure, extending the tenure of judges generally is not a bad thing. What authoritarians normally do, and this is the process that was done, that has been done in Eastern Europe, and there are lots of writings about how Orban in Poland, and you have Hungary, Egypt tried it, but it was shot down in parliament, where authoritarians reduce the retirement age, get rid of judges so they can appoint judges who are more pliant to their cause. So that is the practice that normally we need to watch out for. Extending the tenure is not necessarily a bad thing. In the US, judges actually have life tenure. tenure, so they simply sit until they die or decide to retire. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. The bad thing here is the fact that this is something that is being made subject to acceptance by the president after consultation. So you see the difference between when we're talking about the prosecutor general and promotion of judges. When it comes to these annual extensions, the president makes the decision after consultation. The president doesn't actually have to listen to the JSC, he just has to give careful consideration. So that means that annually, it's a year on year, the judge is not... There's no certainty about tenure, and it's all dependent on whether the president shall accept, not necessarily on the advice of the JSC. These are the problems that I have with this part of the amendment. It would be much better if the acceptance by the president was on the recommendation of the JSC, because that is the employer. And if anybody watched the submissions by the JSC when they were before Parliament, the JSC made it clear that these annual renewals are a problem, and I agree. It should be a 5-year non-renewable term. And the other point behind this amendment is the fact that because our retirement age is 70, a lot of Zimbabwean judges then go and serve on benches within the region, because the general retirement age in the region is 75. And because ours is at the low point of 70, these judges, they leave, but then so basically we lose talent. So it's an attempt to retain talent. That's also a good thing. But it would be better if it was a 5-year term, so that there is more certainty in their tenure. And if anyone is attending public hearings and addressing this, I think what would help you would be to ask why it can't be a 5-year term, rather than to introduce the instability that every single year a judge of this nature has to wonder whether the renewal shall come, because there are obvious questions as to whether that will affect decision making. So that is one provision which there's a good idea. The formulation makes it problematic, and hopefully perhaps through the public consultation process they can be addressed this question of why can't it be just a 5-year term, and why can't it be on the advice of the JSC, rather than inordinately increasing the powers of the president by making it after consultations with the president. So those are the ones which I would put in a mix. I have to agree, of course, with the fact that there's a reduction of accountability and transparency, because a lot of these provisions take away interviews. But let's not overstate how interviews were influencing this process. For me, they were mostly performative in giving the idea of active participation, when it's actually passive participation by the public, whereas the real decision is the JSC. So let's just be honest about that and have the provisions reflect that. The final section are the ones I call the blah provisions. I don't even know what to say about them. First, it removes the running mate clause, meaning the president can appoint the vice president and fire them at will. You can only want a strong vice president if you want them to be a second center of power, but in Zimbabwean politics we simply do not have that. My argument is that we have assistant presidents, we don't have vice presidents, which is why both major political parties go to elective congresses. If the president is removed from their party office or dies or resigns, there is no deputy who takes over. And that is reflected in the national constitution. I don't really see which way you fall on that issue. If you want a strong vice president, it means you actually want a strong center of power and sort of like a president prime minister arrangement, of which the constitution doesn't provide for that. The amendment also increases non-parliamentary ministers from 5 to 7. That will increase the size of government, but I know many Zimbabweans, including prominently Nkosana Moyo, prefer having ministers appointed outside of parliament entirely, just like in the US and in Kenya. So it's still a mix we have in Zimbabwe. I don't know whether you think this is good or bad. The amendment also removes it delinks the delimitation of voter constituencies to the population census. Some people think that's problematic, but our constitution actually says ZEC, in drawing up electoral boundaries, has to consider registered voters, and the census data is really about the total number of people. So ZEC has correctly said that this is really no influence on how we draw up our districts. It's different from countries which use the total population as the basis upon to do redistricting, such as here in the US. We use registered voters. So don't really know how that will affect, if that's good or bad. And then finally, the chief secretary to the president is made a constitutional option. They change from public service to civil service. These are things that I don't think are really material. I want to end by saying that if anyone really plans to go for the public hearings, my only advice would be the fact that let's try to have very distinct and precise demands rather than to simply go with a reflexive defiance and just say we don't want, implement. Let's try to find areas in which we can push the government. For instance, if the government is saying that it wants to help young people by having quotas, we must be in a position to say, okay, thank you for trying to help us with quotas, but can we also address other issues that affect young people, such as lowering the age for running for president? Why must it be 40 years, for instance? Why not 35 like in other countries? Why do you have to be 40 years to be a judge, or to be attorney general, prosecutor general, to be a senator? Why are so many important positions of government locked away from young people simply because of their age? That could be a very important issue to bring, to say it's not just enough to have positions in parliament. What about in councils? What about these important positions in government? What about having a corporate quota so that companies can prove just how much they are helping young people who are looking for attachment, who are looking for jobs? Young people have no experience, that's used against them. These are things that can help all young people, irrespective of whether they are involved in the political process. And I think we must try to focus on making those specific demands so that they can be reflected in the constitutional amendment.